There are certain lives that seem to have been spun from a finer thread, woven with the silk of poetry, the gold of privilege, and the deep, somber indigo of heartbreak. They are lives lived not in the stark prose of ordinary days, but in the lyrical, nuanced language of a half-forgotten fairy tale. The life of Louise de Vilmorin was one such creation. To even speak her name is to conjure an atmosphere of exquisite, almost heartbreaking, French elegance. The scent of rain on a rose garden, the whisper of Chanel silk in a book-lined salon, the echo of a witty remark hanging in the air. She was a novelist, a poet, a society hostess of legendary grace, and a woman who possessed a charm so potent, so unique, that she became the quiet, gravitational center for some of the 20th century's most brilliant and restless men. She was the great lost love of the aviator poet Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and the final calming passion of the adventurer intellectual André Malraux. The writer Truman Capote, a man who understood the rare, captivating nature of true elegance, once perfectly described her as a swan writing in black ink. It's a flawless image, capturing the paradox at her very core, the ethereal, almost fragile grace of her presence, combined with the sharp, definitive, and deeply intelligent mark she left upon the world. But to see her only as a muse, as a beautiful reflection in the eyes of famous men, is to miss the very essence of her story. For beneath the delicate porcelain exterior was a spirit forged in childhood illness, tempered by loss, and armed with a formidable intellect and a will of quiet, unyielding steel. Her life was a constant, graceful navigation of contradictions, between physical frailty and inner strength, between the gilded cage of her aristocratic world and her fiercely independent soul, between the demands of convention and her own profound, unconventional capacity for love. This is not simply the story of a woman who inspired greatness in others. It is the story of a woman who, against the tumultuous backdrop of a France lurching from one crisis to another, quietly insisted on living a life that was in itself a magnificent work of art. To understand the extraordinary creature that was Louise de Vilmorin, one must first breathe the air of the world that created her. She was born in 1902 into the twilight of one era and the dawn of another. This was the France of the haute bourgeoisie, a class that stood at the pinnacle of society, possessing the wealth of industrialists and the cultural refinement of the old aristocracy. It was a world of immense confidence, built on generations of success, yet it was also a world governed by a complex and often unspoken set of rules. Discretion, elegance, and intellectual cultivation were its currencies. One's family name was not merely a label, it was a legacy to be polished and protected. The Vilmorin family was a dynasty, but not of the usual sort. They were not bankers or generals or politicians. They were, in the most elegant and influential way imaginable, gardeners. The family firm, Vilmorin Andrieux, was the most prestigious seed company in the world, a scientific and horticultural powerhouse founded in the 18th century. They were botanical explorers, innovators, who had introduced countless species of flowers and vegetables to European soil. Their wealth was not derived from stocks and bonds, but from the earth itself, from the patient, scientific cultivation of beauty. This gave the family a unique status. They were men of commerce and men of science, yet they lived with the landed grace of aristocrats. This unique heritage was embodied in their family seat, the Château de Verrières-le-Buisson, a magnificent estate just south of Paris. This was no gloomy, drafty fortress. It was a living paradise, a sprawling canvas of botanical wonders. The grounds were a world-renowned arboretum, a tapestry of rare trees, exquisite flower beds, and sprawling nurseries. This was the Eden into which Louise was born, the third of what would eventually be 9 children. Her earliest memories were not of city streets, but of the scent of roses and wet earth, of the rustle of leaves in ancient trees, of a world ordered by the gentle, beautiful rhythms of the seasons. This profound, almost mystical connection to the natural world would infuse her writing with a unique, organic poetry for the rest of her life. Her parents, Philippe de Vilmorin and Mélanie de Gaufridi de Dortan, presided over this kingdom with a kind of benevolent, aristocratic reserve. Philippe was a brilliant botanist and a man of immense culture, while Mélanie, a descendant of an old Provençal family, managed the large household with a quiet, unshakable grace. It was a loving home, but one that adhered to the emotional restraint typical of their class. Children were to be cherished, but from a slight distance their daily lives managed by a retinue of nannies and governesses. This environment fostered a strong sense of sibling solidarity and a rich, imaginative inner life, as the children were often left to create their own entertainment within the magical confines of the estate. The cultural air that Louise breathed was that of a Paris on the cusp of a revolution. The Belle Époque was ending, but the city was still the undisputed center of the artistic universe. This was the Paris of Proust, of Cocteau, of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, of Chanel's radical new fashions. Modernism was exploding in the art galleries and concert halls, yet the social world still revolved around the hallowed institution of the Salon. In the grand drawing rooms of the city's most influential hostesses, the future of French culture was being debated, created, and celebrated over champagne and exquisitely crafted conversation. It was a world that placed a supreme value on wit, on charm, and on the dazzling performance of intelligence. For a young woman like Louise, this world presented a specific set of expectations. Her education, conducted entirely at home, was not designed to prepare her for a career, but to make her a cultivated and desirable wife. She was taught languages, music, art history, and literature. The goal was to produce a woman who could not only manage a grand household, but also shine in a salon, a woman who could be a true partner and a credit to a powerful husband. But this education, while limiting in its ultimate aim, also gave Louise the tools she would later use to forge her own independent identity. Yet this world of intellectual and artistic ferment was underpinned by the rigid foundations of French Catholicism and a strict social code. A woman's reputation was her most precious asset, and scandal could be ruinous. There was a constant, subtle tension between the intellectual freedom celebrated in the salons and the personal conformity demanded by society. This was the delicate tightrope that a young woman of Louise's sensibility and intelligence had to walk. She was raised to be an exquisite, ornamental flower in the Vilmorin garden, destined to be transplanted into the equally cultivated soil of a good marriage. No one, least of all her family, could have predicted that this delicate bloom housed a spirit of such fierce originality, or that her life's path would stray so far from the carefully laid out parterres of her youth. Life in the idyllic bubble of the Château de Verrières-le-Buisson was a kind of waking dream for the young Louise de Vilmorin. With her many siblings, the vast estate was a universe of endless discovery. The days were measured not by clocks, but by the changing light through the leaves of the great cedar trees, by the progression of blooms in the famous iris garden, and by the comforting routines of a large, well-ordered household. It was a childhood steeped in beauty and a sense of profound, almost aristocratic security. But this enchanted world was to be cruelly interrupted. Around the age of 10, Louise was struck down by a mysterious and agonizing ailment. A persistent fever and a searing pain in her leg were eventually diagnosed as osteomyelitis, a severe and dangerous infection of the bone. In an era before antibiotics, such an illness was often a death sentence, or at the very least, a precursor to amputation. For months, she hovered between life and death. The finest doctors were summoned to the chateau, and a series of painful operations were performed. She survived, but the illness left its permanent, indelible mark. The infection had damaged the bone in her leg, leaving her with a slight but noticeable limp that would be her constant companion for the rest of her life, a subtle physical manifestation of the fragility that would become so intertwined with her persona. More than the limp, the illness imposed upon her a long period of convalescence, of enforced stillness and isolation. While her healthy, boisterous siblings ran freely through the gardens, Louise was confined to her room, her world shrinking to the view from her window, and the vast landscape she could explore in books. For an imaginative and sensitive child, this experience could have been a source of profound bitterness and resentment. But for Louise, this period of confinement became a kind of chrysalis. Robbed of the ability to experience the world physically, she began to explore it with her mind and her soul in a way that would define her for the rest of her life. It was during these long, quiet hours that she truly discovered the power of language. Books became her companions, her teachers, and her escape. She devoured the classics in her father's library, but she was most drawn to the poets. Verlaine, Rimbaud, Baudelaire. She absorbed their rhythms, their melancholic beauty, their ability to conjure entire worlds with a few perfect words. And she began, secretly at first, to write her own. In hidden notebooks, she penned delicate, lyrical poems, early explorations of the themes of love, nature, and the bittersweet passage of time that would become the hallmarks of her mature work. Her illness, which had taken so much from her, had given her the one thing that would become her salvation, her voice. It taught her to find beauty in stillness, to observe the world with a heightened, almost painful sensitivity, and to understand that the truest adventures often take place within the boundless geography of the human heart. As she recovered and slowly re-entered the world, she was a changed person. The physical ordeal had imbued her with a quiet resilience and a wisdom beyond her years. It also enhanced her unique charm. She was not a robust, athletic beauty, but something far more captivating. Her physical delicacy, combined with her luminous intelligence and the soft musical quality of her voice, created an aura of ethereal, almost otherworldly grace. When she finally made her debut in Parisian society, she was unlike anyone else. In a world of vivacious, sometimes loud debutantes, Louise was a whisper, a subtle and enchanting presence who drew people to her not with overt glamour, but with the quiet power of her personality. Her mind, honed by years of reading and reflection, was sharp and sophisticated. She flourished in the intellectual atmosphere of the Parisian salons, where her witty, insightful conversation and her deep knowledge of literature quickly made her a sought-after guest. She formed an early and lasting friendship with the avant-garde artist and writer Jean Cocteau, who was immediately captivated by her unique spirit and recognized her nascent literary talent. He became her mentor and champion, encouraging her to take her writing seriously. It was in this glittering, intellectually charged world that she met the man who would become her first great and perhaps most mythic love. He was the Vicomte Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, an aristocrat, a writer, and most thrillingly, a pioneering aviator. In the late 1920s, pilots were the rock stars of their day, daring adventurers who charted new territories and seemed to defy the very laws of nature. Saint-Exupéry was the epitome of this new breed of hero. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed a restless, poetic soul that was constantly drawn to the vast, empty horizons of the desert and the sky. He had flown treacherous mail routes over the Sahara and the Andes, and his early writings about these experiences were already winning him acclaim. Their meeting was a collision of two powerful and complementary forces. He was captivated by her delicate, otherworldly charm and her sharp, poetic intellect. She, who had spent so much of her life in quiet rooms, was utterly enthralled by this man of action, this poet of the skies who seemed to embody a boundless freedom she had never known. They fell into a passionate, intense, and all-consuming love affair. It was a romance that seemed to have been written in the stars, a meeting of two souls who recognized in each other a shared sense of wonder and a deep, underlying melancholy. For a time, they were the golden couple of their circle. He would write her passionate letters from distant airfields, and she would wait for his return to Paris, her world coming alive in his presence. He was, she believed, the great love she had been waiting for, the man who understood the poetry of her own heart. In 1928, he proposed, and she joyfully accepted. She was engaged to be married to her adventurer poet, her prince of the skies. It seemed like the perfect fairy tale ending to her quiet, waiting girlhood. She was about to embark on the greatest adventure of her life, soaring into a future of love and happiness. But the very qualities that had drawn her to him, his restless spirit, his unquenchable thirst for the unknown, his ultimate allegiance to the solitude of the cockpit, were the very things that would ultimately make their shared future an impossibility. The engagement that promised a new beginning was, in fact, the prelude to her first great heartbreak. Their engagement captivated Parisian society, a union of earth and sky, but its brilliance concealed the fragility that would soon end it. It was a romance that seemed to have been scripted by the gods of poetry themselves. She was the delicate, earth-bound flower, rooted in the ancient soil of her family's chateau, a creature of shaded gardens and quiet, introspective verse. He was the celestial adventurer, a man whose home was the vast, cloud-strewn emptiness of the sky, whose poetry was written in the contrails of his tiny plane against the canvas of the heavens. It was a union of opposites, a perfect romantic paradox, and for a time, Louise allowed herself to believe in its magic. She was swept up in the sheer force of his personality, the intoxicating blend of aristocratic charm, daredevil courage, and profound, almost mystical, philosophical depth. His letters sent from remote airfields in the Sahara or the high plains of the Andes, where he was forging the world's first airmail routes, were not mere love notes. They were passionate, lyrical dispatches from another world, filled with meditations on solitude, friendship, and the awesome, terrible beauty of the untamed planet. For a woman who had spent her life cultivating her inner world, he was the ultimate, thrilling emissary from the world outside. She began to dream of a life with him, a life that would be a perpetual adventure of the heart and mind. But the dream soon began to collide with a much harsher reality. The very qualities that made Saint-Exupéry a legend were the ones that made him an almost impossible partner. His restlessness was not a quirk. It was the fundamental essence of his being. He was a man who could only truly breathe at 10,000 feet, a soul who was only at peace when courting danger. The stable, shared, domestic life that Louise, for all her unconventionality, secretly craved was anathema to him. His long absences stretched from weeks into months, punctuated by terrifying silences when news would arrive of another crash, another disappearance in the desert or the mountains. Living with him, she quickly realized, was not a peaceful communion, but a state of perpetual anxiety. Her delicate health, always a factor in her life, was strained by the constant worry. Furthermore, she began to feel the subtle but powerful disapproval of his circle, particularly his formidable and devoutly Catholic mother, Marie de Fonscolombe. To them, Louise, with her ethereal artistic sensibility and her slightly bohemian reputation, may have seemed an unsuitable match for their heroic world-striding son. They saw a fragility in her that they feared would not withstand the rigors of his extraordinary life. The fundamental conflict came down to a simple, unbridgeable chasm. He needed the sky, she needed the earth. He was a man defined by his departures, she was a woman defined by her home. The love between them was real, passionate, and profound, but their visions of life were irreconcilable. Saint-Exupéry, tormented by this conflict, began to pull away. He adored her, but he knew with the unflinching honesty that characterized his writing that he could not give her the life she deserved without sacrificing the very essence of himself. The end, when it came, was a devastating blow. It was not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, painful fading. He broke off the engagement, not with cruelty, but with a kind of deep, sorrowful regret that was, in its own way, even more painful. For Louise, it was a profound and public humiliation. The fairy tale had ended, the prince had flown away, and she was left grounded, her heart shattered. The experience plunged her into a deep depression. It was a heartbreak that went beyond the loss of a man. It was the loss of a dream, a future, an entire imagined life of poetry and adventure. The wound was deep, and it would shape her understanding of love for the rest of her life, instilling in her a permanent melancholic awareness of its beautiful, but ultimately fragile and unreliable nature. In the aftermath of this great romantic cataclysm, Louise did what so many well-bred young women of her era were expected to do. She sought refuge in convention. If a life of wild, poetic passion was not to be hers, then perhaps a life of stability, security, and social propriety would offer a different kind of solace. In 1930, she married Comte Guy de la Rochefoucauld, a scion of one of France's oldest and most distinguished aristocratic families. On paper, it was a perfect match. He was handsome, titled, and respectable. The marriage anchored her firmly within the highest echelons of French society and offered her a life of predictable, elegant comfort. She threw herself into her new role as the Comtesse de la Rochefoucauld, managing their grand household and, in time, giving birth to 3 daughters, Jessie, Alexandra, and Helene. For a while, this new life seemed to work. Motherhood brought her a new kind of joy, and the rhythms of family life provided a welcome distraction from her past heartbreak. She was a devoted, if somewhat unconventional, mother, preferring to enchant her children with fantastical stories and poems rather than enforce strict discipline. She entertained with the effortless grace that was her birthright, her home becoming a quiet hub for her circle of artistic and aristocratic friends. Yet beneath the polished surface of this seemingly perfect life, a deep sense of dissatisfaction began to grow. The marriage, while not unhappy, was devoid of the intellectual fire and emotional intensity she craved. Guy de la Rochefoucauld was a kind and honorable man, but he was a conventional aristocrat, more interested in hunting and managing his estates than in discussing poetry or philosophy. The passionate meeting of minds that she had experienced with Saint-Exupéry was completely absent. She was respected, she was secure, But she was also profoundly, achingly bored. The quiet, respectable life she had chosen as a sanctuary was beginning to feel like a beautifully decorated prison. She was playing a role, the perfect comtesse, but the woman underneath, the poet, the dreamer, was slowly suffocating. After more than a decade of this quiet compromise, the marriage ended in a discreet and civilized divorce. Louise had chosen authenticity over security. Her second marriage in 1937 to Paul Patoff, a wealthy American financier, was a brief and rather baffling interlude. It seemed to be an attempt to swing the pendulum in the opposite direction, away from the stuffy traditions of the French aristocracy and towards the glamour and modernity of the international set. But this too proved to be a misstep. The marriage was short-lived, a fleeting and ultimately hollow experience that only served to confirm what she was slowly beginning to understand. Her true fulfillment would not be found in a man or a title or a fortune. It would have to be found within herself. And so, in the late 1930s, in the wake of two failed marriages and the lingering ghost of her great lost love, Louise de Vilmorin finally turned back to her first and truest passion, writing. The emotional turmoil of the preceding decade, the years of heartbreak, quiet desperation, and profound disillusionment had not destroyed her. It had instead given her a deep well of experience from which to draw. She retreated to the familiar, comforting embrace of her family's chateau, Verrières-le-Buisson, and began for the first time to write with serious, disciplined intent. The result, published in 1934, was her first novel, Sainte une fois. The book was a revelation. It was utterly unlike anything else being published in France at the time. It was not a work of social realism or political commentary, but a strange, lyrical, and enchanting fable, a story that seemed to have been spun from moonlight and melancholy. Her prose was exquisite, possessing a classical purity and a poetic rhythm that felt both timeless and utterly original. Critics were captivated. They praised her unique voice, her fantastical imagination, and her ability to explore complex emotional states through the delicate lens of allegory. The book was not a commercial blockbuster, but it was a resounding critical success that instantly established her as a significant and singular talent in the Parisian literary world. With this newfound confidence, she began to transform her life. The Château de Verrières-le-Buisson, which had been her childhood home and her adult refuge, now became her kingdom. She began to host her own informal salons, gatherings that quickly became legendary. She was no longer just a guest in the great houses of others. She was now the hostess, the quiet, captivating center of her own intellectual and artistic universe. On any given weekend, one might find a dazzling array of guests wandering through her magnificent gardens. Her old friend Jean Cocteau, the composers Francis Poulenc and Georges Auric, the surrealist artist Man Ray, and a host of writers, aristocrats, and intellectuals. These were not stuffy, formal affairs. Louise's gift was for creating an atmosphere of relaxed, intimate, and sparkling conversation. She had a unique ability to draw people out, to connect disparate personalities, and to foster an environment where creativity could flourish. She was creating a world on her own terms, a world built not on a husband's status, but on her own formidable charm, intellect, and artistic talent. She was finally becoming the woman she was always meant to be, not just a muse, but a creator, a woman who was herself a work of art. But even as she was building this perfect, idyllic world of art and friendship, the larger world, outside the chateau's walls, was growing darker. The late 1930s was a time of rising tension and palpable dread in Europe. The Spanish Civil War was raging, and the aggressive posturing of Nazi Germany was casting a long, ominous shadow over the continent. The carefree artistic world that Louise and her friends inhabited, with its focus on beauty and intellectual pursuits, began to seem fragile, a beautiful but precarious bubble poised to burst. It was during this time that Antoine de Saint-Exupéry re-entered her life, not as a lover, but as a correspondent and a friend. He was now a world-famous author, celebrated for his philosophical aviation memoirs, but he was also a deeply worried patriot. He saw the coming storm with a clarity that many of his contemporaries lacked, and he was consumed with a sense of duty to a France he saw as complacent and unprepared. His letters to Louise from this period took on a new tone, less romantic, but filled with an even deeper intimacy. He confided in her his fears for their country, his despair at the rise of barbarism, and his unwavering belief in the humanist values they both held dear. For Louise, this rekindled connection was a source of both comfort and a new kind of anxiety. The man she had once loved for his adventurous spirit was now preparing to fly into the heart of a conflict that threatened to destroy everything they held dear. Her own, hard-won world of personal and artistic fulfillment was about to be tested by the brutal, impersonal forces of history. The poet, the hostess, the lover, was about to face her greatest challenge yet, surviving in a world where the gardens were being overrun by the forces of war and where the sky that had once symbolized freedom and romance was about to become a battlefield. The end of the 1930s saw Louise de Vilmorin standing at a precipice, both personal and historical. She had weathered the storms of her own heart, emerging from the wreckage of a great heartbreak, and two failed marriages not as a victim, but as a newly minted and critically acclaimed author. At her family's ancestral chateau, she had begun to cultivate a world of her own making, a sanctuary of art, intellect, and friendship. But the delicate, beautiful bubble she had so carefully constructed was about to be pierced by the brutal realities of a world descending into madness. As the jackboots of the Third Reich began their march across Europe, the idyllic peace of Verrières-le-Buisson, and indeed of all of France, was living on borrowed time. The outbreak of war in September 1939, followed by the terrifyingly swift and humiliating fall of France in the spring of 1940, was a cataclysm that shattered the nation's psyche. The phony war gave way to the blitzkrieg, and within weeks Paris, the luminous heart of French culture, was an occupied city. For Louise, as for millions of her compatriots, it was an unimaginable trauma. The world she had known, a world of intellectual freedom, artistic expression, and civilized discourse, was suddenly extinguished, replaced by the grim gray twilight of the German occupation. While many of her social standing fled to neutral countries or the unoccupied free zone in the South, Louise made a quiet but resolute choice. She would remain at Verrières. The chateau, her sanctuary, would now become her fortress. It was an act of passive but profound resistance. To simply stay, to maintain a semblance of normal French life under the noses of the occupiers, to continue to cultivate her garden and write her poems, was to refuse to be erased, to insist on the endurance of a culture that the invaders sought to crush. But her resistance was not merely passive. The very qualities that defined her, her aristocratic poise, her vast social network, and her ability to present a disarming, slightly ethereal facade, became her most effective weapons. In a world of suspicion and betrayal, the Château de Verrières-le-Buisson, with its sprawling grounds and hidden corners, became a quiet, crucial node in the clandestine network of the French resistance. This was not the stuff of dramatic, gun-wielding heroism, but something far more subtle and in many ways more dangerous. It was the resistance of whispers, of hidden doors, and of immense unspoken courage. Louise's role was that of a facilitator, a protector. Her home became a safe house, a temporary haven for those on the run from the Gestapo. Downed Allied airmen, their planes shot from the sky over occupied territory, would be furtively brought to the chateau under the cover of darkness. There, Louise would provide them with food, civilian clothes, and a place to hide while the local resistance network arranged for their perilous journey south toward Spain and freedom. She moved through these dangerous operations with a preternatural calm, her years of navigating complex social situations now repurposed for a far deadlier game. When German patrols would make their rounds, she would greet them at the door with the impeccable, slightly distracted charm of the great lady of the house, discussing the weather or the state of her roses, her heart pounding as an English or American pilot hid in a secret priest hole or a cellar beneath her feet. Her social connections were also invaluable. She maintained a correspondence with the influential friends who had escaped to London or New York, embedding coded messages within seemingly innocuous letters about family news and literary gossip. She was a master of the unspoken, her delicate handwriting carrying information that could mean life or death. One particularly harrowing incident involved sheltering a high-ranking member of the SOE, the British Special Operations Executive, for nearly a month. The agent was recovering from an injury, and the hunt for him was intense. Louise organized a constant rotating series of house guests, trusted friends and family, to provide a plausible cover for the extra person in the house, throwing off potential informers and deflecting the suspicions of the local authorities. It was an incredibly stressful and dangerous performance, one that required nerves of steel beneath her porcelain exterior. She was risking not only her own life, but the lives of her children and her entire family. This quiet, steadfast heroism was the ultimate expression of her character, a profound sense of duty hidden beneath a veil of exquisite, disarming grace. During these dark, uncertain years, her most vital emotional and intellectual lifeline was her rekindled correspondence with Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He was in exile in New York, a lonely and deeply unhappy Titan. He chafed at his distance from the conflict, feeling like a caged eagle while his country suffered. He poured all of his frustration, his philosophical despair, and his boundless, aching love for France into his writing, producing during this time his two masterpieces, the wartime memoir Flight to Arras and the immortal fable The Little Prince. Their letters, carried across the Atlantic by clandestine means, became a profound dialogue, a meeting of two souls navigating the same global tragedy from opposite ends of the experience. He, in the frustrating safety of exile, wrote to her of his grand philosophical torments, of his fears that the spiritual essence of France was being destroyed forever. He saw the war in epic, almost mystical terms. She, living the daily grinding reality of the occupation, wrote back with news of home, with descriptions of the changing seasons in the garden at Verrières, with small, intimate details that kept the concrete reality of their beloved country alive for him. She was his anchor, his connection to the very soil he was fighting for. Her letters were not political treatises. They were something far more powerful. They were testaments to endurance. She wrote of the struggle to find food, the oppressive silence of the curfew, but also of the small moments of beauty and defiance, a hidden concert of Debussy's music, a shared bottle of wine with a trusted friend, the defiant beauty of the roses blooming in her garden, as if in spite of the darkness. For him, her letters were like a transfusion of hope, a reminder of the quiet, resilient, and beautiful France that was worth fighting for. For her, his letters were a connection to the larger world, a reminder that the struggle had a purpose and that she was not alone. Their relationship had transformed. The passionate, fraught romance of their youth had deepened into a platonic but intensely emotional soulmating. They were no longer lovers, but something perhaps more profound. They were spiritual allies, two poets holding a single flickering candle against a great and terrible darkness. In one of his last letters to her, he wrote, "I feel the need to tell you how much I need your friendship. You are for me a country of tenderness of which I have a desperate need." In the summer of 1944, the tide of the war finally turned. The Allied forces landed in Normandy, and the slow, bloody process of liberating France began. On August 25th, Paris was freed. It was a moment of ecstatic, tearful, and chaotic joy. People flooded the streets, waving the tricolor, embracing the Allied soldiers, and seeking a violent, often brutal reckoning with those who had collaborated. For Louise, watching from Verrières, it was a moment of profound relief, the end of a 4-year nightmare. The light, it seemed, was finally returning to France. But this moment of national euphoria was to be immediately followed by the most devastating personal blow of her life. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who had pulled every string to get back into the fight, had finally been given command of a reconnaissance squadron based in Corsica. He was older than the other pilots, but he was determined to fly for his country one last time. On the morning of July 31st, 1944, just a few weeks before the liberation of Paris, he took off in his unarmed P-38 Lightning for a mission over the Rhone Valley, gathering intelligence on German troop movements. He was scheduled to return in a few hours. He never came back. The news of his disappearance was a slow, agonizing torment. At first there was hope. He could have crashed and been taken prisoner. He could be hiding with the resistance. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, a terrible silent certainty began to set in. The sky, which had been his kingdom and his inspiration, had claimed him for its own. There was no body, no wreckage, no final message. He had simply vanished, a poet disappearing into the very ether he had so beautifully described. For Louise, the loss was absolute and unutterable. His mysterious, unresolved end was a particularly cruel twist of fate. There was no grave to visit, no final farewell, only a profound and endless absence. The man who had been her first great love, her intellectual soulmate, and her wartime confidant was gone. The loss transformed him in her heart and mind, from a flesh and blood man into a myth, an eternal symbol of courage, poetry, and tragic, unfinished romance. The grief of his disappearance would remain with her for the rest of her days, a quiet, sorrowful undercurrent to all the joy and success that was still to come. As France emerged from the rubble of the war, it was a nation in the throes of a painful and exhilarating rebirth. The post-liberation period was a time of fierce political and intellectual ferment. The old order had been swept away, and a new France was struggling to be born. It was in this supercharged atmosphere of renewal that Louise de Vilmorin, herself emerging from the crucible of war and personal loss, would embark on the next great love affair of her life, a relationship that would place her at the very heart of this new France. His name was André Malraux, and he was not just a man. He was a force of nature, a living legend. He was everything the new heroic France aspired to be, a brilliant prize-winning novelist whose book Man's Fate had defined a generation, a daredevil adventurer who had hunted for lost temples in the Cambodian jungle and flown for the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, a heroic leader of the resistance who had fought bravely against the Nazis, and now a towering intellectual and a key political figure at the right hand of the new leader of France, General Charles de Gaulle. Malraux was a man of demonic energy and tormented genius. He was consumed by a grand, tragic vision of the human condition, by the eternal struggle between human dignity and the meaninglessness of the universe. He was a notoriously complex, intense, and difficult man, his mind a constant churning vortex of ideas, ambitions, and deep-seated anxieties. He had been married twice, but his relationships had always been tempestuous. He needed more than a wife. He needed an intellectual equal, a spiritual confidant, a woman who could withstand the sheer force of his personality and provide a calm center to his inner storm. He found her in Louise de Vilmorin. Their connection was immediate, electric, and profound. It was a meeting not of opposites, as her relationship with Saint-Exupéry had been, but of equals. In her, Malraux found one of the few women in the world who could match his intellectual fire. She understood his philosophical complexities, but she could also counter his tragic, often heavy worldview with her own light, poetic, and witty sensibility. He was fascinated by her mind, captivated by her unique charm, and soothed by her innate grace. In him, Louise found the intellectual soulmate she had always craved. Theirs was not the dreamy, youthful romance she had known before. It was a mature, exhilarating, and deeply passionate partnership of two of the most brilliant minds in France. Their home in the Parisian suburb of Verrières-le-Buisson, the same chateau that had been her sanctuary, now became the most vibrant and influential salon of the post-war era. Louise, with Malraux by her side, entered the golden age of her life. She had survived the darkness, endured an unimaginable loss, and was now embarking on a new thrilling chapter, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man who was helping to shape the very destiny of their reborn nation. The Swan was no longer riding in the shadows. She was now at the very center of the cultural and political stage. The liberation of France in 1944 was not merely the end of a war, it was the beginning of a fierce and brilliant battle for the nation's soul. Out of the ashes of occupation and collaboration, a new France was struggling to be born, a France hungry for ideas, for moral clarity, and for a culture that could wash away the stain of the preceding years. At the very epicenter of this intellectual and artistic renaissance was a quiet, elegant chateau in the Parisian suburbs, and at its heart was Louise de Vilmorin. With the towering, tormented genius André Malraux now by her side, she entered the most luminous and influential period of her life. The shy, poetic girl had survived the darkness. She was now to become the unofficial queen of the new French dawn. Louise was the conductor of this magnificent, chaotic orchestra. She possessed a unique and magical gift for social chemistry. With a gentle word or a shared smile, she could soothe the notoriously prickly egos of the great artists and thinkers who flocked to her home. She created an atmosphere not of performance but of true intimacy. People felt they could be themselves at Verrières. They could test out new ideas, confess their doubts, and engage in the kind of free-flowing, exhilarating conversation that was the lifeblood of French culture. She would drift through the rooms, a delicate, almost silent presence, ensuring every glass was full, every guest felt seen, and every conversation was sparkling. She was not the loud, domineering hostess of old. She was the quiet, gravitational force around which this entire brilliant universe revolved, the heart of this universe, and the furnace that powered its intellectual energy was her relationship with André Malraux. Theirs was one of the great intellectual love affairs of the 20th century. It was a partnership of breathtaking intensity, a constant, thrilling dialogue between two extraordinary minds. Malraux was, by this time, a global figure. His novels had made him a literary giant, and his heroic leadership in the resistance had made him a political one. He was a man possessed by grand, often dark philosophical questions about destiny, art, and the meaning of human existence in a godless world. He was also a man of immense personal complexity, plagued by nervous tics, intense anxieties, and periods of profound crushing depression he referred to as his funereal drone. Louise was perhaps the only person in the world who could truly understand and manage this tormented genius. She was his intellectual equal, capable of debating the finer points of art history or political theory with him for hours. She became his first reader, his most trusted critic, and his essential sounding board. As he worked on his monumental multi-volume meditation on art, The Voices of Silence, it was Louise who would listen to his ideas, challenge his assumptions, and help him shape his revolutionary thoughts. She provided the calm, poetic counterpoint to his intense, often jagged intellect. But her role went far beyond the intellectual. She was his emotional sanctuary. She understood his demons, and she knew how to soothe them. She created at Verrières a world of beauty, order, and peace that was the perfect antidote to the chaos of his inner world and the pressures of his public life. She knew when to engage him in debate and when to distract him with a walk through the garden. She managed his moods, protected him from the intrusions of the outside world, and loved him with a deep, empathetic, and unconditional understanding. Their bond was forged in the crucible of shared intellect and a profound, almost telepathic, emotional connection. It was a love affair that was also a full-time, all-consuming, and often exhausting vocation. It was during this period of intense personal and intellectual fulfillment that Louise produced some of her most celebrated and mature literary work. She had found her stride as a writer, her voice now imbued with a new psychological depth and a melancholic wisdom born of her wartime experiences and her great personal losses. In 1951, she wrote the short, perfect, and devastatingly elegant novella that would become her most famous work on the international stage. The book is a masterpiece of subtlety and suggestion. On the surface, it is a simple, tragic tale of a society woman in Belle Époque Paris, known only as Madame D, who sells a pair of diamond earrings, a gift from her husband, to pay off a secret debt. This single act sets in motion a chain of events, as the earrings are bought and re-gifted, passing from her husband to his mistress, from the mistress to a diplomat, and from the diplomat, who has fallen in love with Madame de, back to her. The earrings become a silent, glittering symbol of the secret loves, the hidden debts, and the unspoken deceptions that lie just beneath the polished surface of high society. Trapped in a web of her own making, unable to confess the truth to either her husband or her lover, Madame de is ultimately consumed by her secrets, her story ending in quiet, elegant tragedy. The novella is a marvel of psychological acuity. With her sparse, jewel-like prose, Louise captures the exquisite agony of a woman trapped by convention, a heart breaking silently behind a facade of impeccable manners. The story is a profound meditation on the deceptive nature of appearances, the terrible weight of secrets, and the often fatal consequences of a society that values propriety above all else. It is impossible not to see in the story echoes of Louise's own life, her own understanding of the compromises and heartbreaks that can hide behind a life of apparent privilege. In 1953, the legendary director Max Ophüls adapted the novella into a film, The Earrings of Madame de, a cinematic masterpiece that is now considered one of the greatest films ever made. The film, starring Danielle Darrieux and Charles Boyer, perfectly captured the novel's mood of glittering romantic despair and brought Louise de Vilmorin's name to a global audience. Her life with Malraux continued to be a whirlwind of culture and politics. When their friend and hero, Charles de Gaulle, was swept back into power in 1958, founding the French Fifth Republic, he appointed Malraux as his first Minister of Cultural Affairs. This was a position of immense power, created specifically for Malraux, and he used it to revolutionize the cultural life of the nation. He was no mere bureaucrat. He was a cultural czar, commissioning vast public art projects, cleaning the soot from the buildings of Paris, and championing the idea that access to art was a fundamental human right. And by his side always was Louise. Though she held no official title, Malraux was still technically married to his first wife, from whom he was long separated. She was the de facto first lady of French culture. She was the hostess for state dinners, with visiting artists and heads of state, the trusted advisor on cultural appointments, the elegant, calming presence who smoothed the way for Malraux's often abrasive genius. She navigated this world of high-stakes politics and diplomacy with the same effortless grace she had always possessed. She was a quiet, almost invisible, but absolutely essential partner in one of the great cultural projects of the 20th century. She was living a life of extraordinary influence and fulfillment. She was at the height of her literary powers, the beloved partner of one of the most powerful men in France, and the hostess of the most brilliant salon in the country. Her world seemed blessed, a perfect, carefully constructed universe of art, love, and intellect. And then, in a single brutal moment in May of 1961, that perfect world was shattered by a tragedy so profound it almost defies comprehension. André Malraux had two sons from his relationship with his late partner, Josette Clotilde, Gautier, and Vincent. On a Saturday afternoon, the two boys, aged 18 and 20, were driving home when their car skidded on a wet road and crashed into a tree. Both were killed instantly. The news was a blow of unimaginable force. It plunged Malraux into a grief so absolute, so profound that his friends feared he would never recover. The man who had written so eloquently about human destiny was now faced with the most meaningless and cruel of fates. His two brilliant, beloved sons were gone. The tragedy broke him. He retreated into a silent, unreachable world of sorrow, unable to work, unable to speak, a great towering intellect completely hollowed out by grief. In this moment of ultimate darkness, Louise was his only anchor. She marshaled all of her immense emotional strength and empathy to guide him through the abyss. She managed everything, protecting him from the well-meaning intrusions of the world, sitting with him in the silence for hours and slowly, patiently, beginning the painstaking process of coaxing him back to life. It was the most difficult and demanding role she had ever had to play. She had to absorb the full, terrifying force of his grief, while managing her own profound sorrow for the two boys she had loved as her own. It was a test that would have broken a lesser person, but Louise, the woman forged in the quiet crucible of her own childhood suffering, did not break. She became his rock, his lifeline. It was a long and agonizing process, but eventually, with her unwavering, gentle support, Malraux slowly began to emerge from the darkness. The tragedy left a permanent scar on both of them, a shared wound that bound them together with a new, somber, and unbreakable intensity. Their relationship, which had been a partnership of the mind, now became a partnership of shared survival. They had faced the absolute worst that life could throw at them, and they had, together, endured. The experience deepened her understanding of human suffering and would infuse her later work with an even greater sense of pathos and a hard-won wisdom. The Swan had navigated the darkest of waters, her grace not only intact, but deepened by the terrible weight of sorrow she now carried. The shared trauma of losing André Malraux's sons in 1961 forged a new, deeper, and more somber alloy in the soul of their relationship. The glittering, carefree optimism of the post-war years was gone, replaced by the hard-won wisdom of those who have stared into the abyss and survived. Louise, who had already known so much loss, now became the quiet, steadfast guardian of Malraux's immense grief. Their partnership, always an intellectual tour de force, now became a partnership of mutual survival, a quiet pact to find meaning and purpose in a world that had shown them its most cruel and arbitrary face. Malraux, with Louise's unwavering support, threw himself back into his monumental work as France's Minister of Cultural Affairs with a renewed, almost manic intensity. The 1960s became the golden age of his ministry, and Louise was his silent, indispensable partner. While he was the public face, the thundering orator who championed the democratization of art, she was the private architect of the world that made his work possible. Their home at Verrières was no longer just an intellectual salon. It was the unofficial Ministry of Culture, the place where grand projects were born, and international cultural diplomacy was conducted with an elegance and intimacy that no government building could replicate. It was Louise who hosted the dinner where the final details of sending the Mona Lisa on its triumphant tour to America were ironed out. It was she who charmed visiting dignitaries, artists, and philanthropists, smoothing the path for Malraux's ambitious and often controversial initiatives, like his network of Maisons de la Couture, designed to bring art to the provinces. She was the one who translated his dense, often impenetrable intellectual pronouncements into a language that the rest of the world could understand. She was, in every sense, the soul of his ministry, the provider of the grace, wit, and human connection that tempered his sometimes abrasive genius. She held no title, but her influence was everywhere, a quiet, pervasive, and utterly essential force in the cultural life of Gaullist France. This period also saw her continue to produce her own literary work, though her output slowed under the demands of her life with Malraux. Her later novels became more introspective, more overtly melancholic, filled with a profound understanding of the illusions of memory and the quiet sorrows of the heart. Her 1960 novel, Les Belles Amours, is a particularly poignant exploration of the loves of 3 generations of women, a meditation on the recurring patterns of passion and disappointment that she had come to know so well. Her writing was, as always, exquisite, but it was now imbued with the unmistakable gravitas of someone who had lived deeply and suffered greatly. The end of this grand era came, as it did for all of France, in the spring of 1968. The student protests and workers' strikes that erupted in Paris shook the foundations of the Gaullist state. For Malraux, a man who had been a youthful revolutionary himself, the sight of students throwing cobblestones at the police was a profoundly disorienting experience. He was now part of the establishment they were rebelling against. A year later, in 1969, Charles de Gaulle resigned from the presidency, and with him, André Malraux's long tenure as the master of France's cultural destiny came to an end. The whirlwind of public life ceased. They retreated from the center of power into a quieter, more private existence at Verrières. For Louise, it was perhaps a relief. The constant demands of their public role had been exhausting. but it also marked the beginning of a final, more contemplative and ultimately more fragile chapter of their lives. Malraux's first wife, Clara, had passed away several years earlier, which meant he was legally single. And yet, he and Louise never married. The question has always lingered, a poignant, unanswered footnote to their great love story. Perhaps, after so many years, they felt their unique, profound bond needed no legal validation. Or perhaps, for a man as complex and commitment-averse as Malraux, the final step was simply one he could not take. Whatever the reason, they remained as they had always been, two sovereign intellects, bound by a love that defied all conventional definition. It was during this period of quiet retreat that Louise's own physical fragility, the lifelong companion that had first shaped her as a child, began to reassert itself. Her delicate health, always a concern, started to seriously decline. She suffered from a worsening heart condition that left her increasingly weak and tired. The ethereal bird-like quality that had so enchanted people now became a genuine physical frailty. She spent more and more time resting, her world shrinking once again, as it had in her childhood, to the beloved confines of her home and garden. She faced this final decline with the same lack of self-pity and the same quiet courage that had defined her entire life. On the 23rd of November 1969, at her home in Verrières, with André Malraux by her side, Louise de Vilmorin died of a heart attack. She was 67 years old. Her death was the quiet end to a life lived at the roaring center of French culture for half a century. For Malraux, the loss was absolute. He had lost his anchor, his muse, his intellectual equal, and the only person who truly understood the labyrinth of his own soul. He would spend the remaining years of his life writing his memoirs, a vast philosophical work in which the ghost of Louise, her voice, and her unique poetic sensibility are a constant, palpable presence. Her death was not just the end of a life, it was the end of a conversation, one of the most brilliant and beautiful conversations the 20th century had ever known. So, what is the lasting legacy of this extraordinary woman, this Swan writing in black ink? It is a legacy as subtle, as multifaceted, and as enduringly beautiful as her own prose. Literarily, she left behind a body of work that stands as a testament to the power of a unique and uncompromising artistic vision. In an age dominated by literary heavyweights and grand political themes, she crafted a world of her own, a world of lyrical fables, of delicate psychological nuance, and of exquisite, precise language. Her masterpiece, Madame de, remains a perfect jewel-like exploration of the tragedies that can unfold beneath a polished surface, a timeless story of love, illusion, and the devastating weight of unspoken truths. She reminds us that literature can be both feather-light in its touch and profoundly heavy in its emotional impact. Culturally, her influence was both immense and wonderfully intangible. Her salon at Verrières was more than just a party. It was a crucible, a place where the culture of a nation was being actively forged. She was a passeur, a connector, a woman whose genius lay in her ability to bring brilliant people together and create an atmosphere where magic could happen. She embodied a certain timeless ideal of French elegance, an elegance that was not about wealth or status, but about wit, intelligence, and a profound appreciation for beauty in all its forms, from a perfectly turned phrase to a rose blooming in her garden. And what of her role as a muse? The debate over whether this diminishes her own creative stature ultimately misses the point. The life of Louise de Vilmorin demonstrates that being a creator and being a muse are not mutually exclusive. They are, in a rare soul like hers, two sides of the same coin. She was an artist who created beautiful things on the page, and she was an artist who created beautiful relationships in her life. Her ability to inspire, challenge, and nurture the genius of men like Saint-Exupéry and Malraux was not a passive act. It was an active, creative, and intellectually demanding one. Her life stands as a powerful testament to the fact that the greatest collaborations are born of love, and the greatest love affairs are, at their heart, a collaboration of souls. Ultimately, the story of Louise de Vilmorin is a profound and moving exploration of the human heart. It is the story of a woman who, from the enforced stillness of a sick bed, built a universe of boundless imagination. It is the story of a woman who loved two of the most restless and brilliant men of her time, not in spite of their complexities, but because of them, and who endured the heartbreak that came with loving men who belonged as much to the world as they did to her. She faced war, loss, and illness with a quiet, unshakable courage, never losing her capacity for joy, her belief in beauty, or her wickedly sharp sense of humor. She lived her life as she wrote her novels, with an exquisite sensitivity, a profound understanding of the nuances of human emotion, and an unwavering commitment to her own unique poetic truth. She reminds us that the most powerful lives are not always the loudest, and that true strength often lies in a delicate, resilient grace. Louise de Vilmorin was a woman who sought a love as profound as a poem, and in the end, her entire life became one.